go and come back.
Ietf, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. I just wanted to try. Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Yeah, we are not super tight, so it's totally fine. And I will let as many questions as come up. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I will give you a clicker. I will run the slides from my device, so there's nothing you really need to look. Yeah, and you will be able to see them here. So I think that's pretty much it. It's totally fine. We are not tight, and I can put a timer so you have an idea of where you are. But if it takes a few minutes more, it's not an issue. Usually it is, but we had one cancellation, so we're flexible. Awesome. Sí. La sesión no está apareciendo. No sé si tienes que decir una cosa. Sí, no sé. Estoy intentando entrar a través de la agenda. Pero si hay gente en el hallway no van a ver la sesión. Ok, interesante. Además que no había visto lo del hallway todavía. ¿Lo puedes decir en el chat? Suele haber alguien técnico mirando. No, en el de la sesión. Seguro que hay gente de Miteco o algo así y alguien... Sí. All right. Welcome everybody to this session of Rasprg, Research and Analysis of Standardization Processes Proposed Research Group. First of all, the node well. This covers some of the main policies that apply to the conduct and Colin?
Hi. Just a quick reminder, you have the wrong slide here. They very much do apply to this meeting.
Huh. Sorry about that.
So we can correct the slides, but just to be clear, the disclosure rules do definitely apply to this meeting.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know how I mix them up. 1 second. I can probably fix that. Not completely, but
yeah, we can fix it for the minutes. Yeah.
Note that audio and video, everything is recorded for audio and video. And if you go to the microphone, you will be recorded. And if you are not wearing a red badge, you are agreeing to be photographed, and that might be shared. There are more details here, and you can check them on the slides, and I encourage you to do so. I will correct the issue that Colin mentioned before. We also have a privacy and code of conduct. Note that this is a high-level overview, but all the details are in the relevant links in RFCs, and you are encouraged to look into them. This is the Research Analysis Standardization Processes proposed research group. And what we do in this research group is try to understand the standardization processes via evidence-based reproducible work. Our goal is to do joint reports, papers, presentations, tools, data, open source software. It is not the goal of this research group to do a hierarchical comparison between SDOs, and it is not the goal of this research group to directly influence IETF operations. Though, of course, we welcome analysis of other SDOs. This is not restricted to the IETF. And if there are learnings that can be taken from here by the IETF, that's fantastic, but it's not our direct goal. My name is Ignacio Castro. My other co-chair is Niels Ten Oliver, who is stepping down. And you can find the charter in the relevant link, which you can access through this link or through the agenda. Please join the mail list if the work here seems relevant to you. Very simple rules. Please scan the QR code, whether you are physically present or remote, for doing any Q&A. And we're not very tight, so the speakers do not need to rush to get ready when the other Q&A are taking place. Can I give my profuse gratitude to whoever agrees to be the note taker? Eternal gratitude? Any buyers? Coffee and beer? Really appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah. So going to the agenda, I will soon finish the welcome and the agenda bashing, and we have 4 speakers. We have first Diane Lyo, who is going to be presenting One Size Does Not Fit All, Why Gender Matters in Standards Development. Then Alessandra Aloca will present Networks and Power, the effects of random selection into NOMCOM. Then Kalia Young will present ARC Regenerative Communities Protocol. And finally, Robert Gell will be talking about ActivityPub and non-standard standard. And with that, I welcome our first speaker, Diane. You can come to the stage. I will share your slides. Here you have the clicker. Diane Liao is a senior researcher at the Standards Council of Canada, and her work focuses on applying quantitative and qualitative methodologies to demonstrate the social and economic value of standardization, assess program performance, and public policies. And Diane has published research on the topics of SMEs, gender, and trade. And I thought it would be an interesting thing to bring in a speaker from a different standards organization to tell us about their experiences with regards to gender issues. And with that, Diane, the room is yours.
Thank you. So hi everyone, thanks for the opportunity to present here. My name is Diane Liao. I'm from Standards Council of Canada, which is the national standardization body here in Canada. So actually it was my colleague Michelle Pakuda that was invited, and she is leading the gender responsive standards in ISO, IEC, and UN ECE. But unfortunately the meeting schedule doesn't work for her. So here I am trying to present uh, for her to explain why gender matters in standards development. And please keep in mind that although today's focus is about gender, there are other marginalized groups that are also systematically disadvantaged, such as visual minorities, Aboriginal peoples, disability, or other identity that can put certain population under greater risk. So 3 years ago, ISO and IEC conduct a gender survey to the chair of their technical committees and asked whether they consider gender in their work. And only 25% of them said yes. And in the survey, we received comments like, safety issues do not distinguish between men and women, so when writing the requirements, we don't have to distinguish whether a man or woman shall be protected. Or comments like committee work is independent of gender and should never be part of the committee work. Although we would like to believe that product and safety doesn't distinguish based on gender, the reality is that they do. Okay, so women are 73% more likely to be severely injured in the car accidents compared to men. A couple years ago, my colleague Michelle done a research on the association between standardization and accidental death. And when she further broke down the data by gender, she found that the results aren't the same across gender. While the association uh, shows that the increase in the participation in standardization is significantly associated with the decrease of accidental death for men, this association wasn't significant for women. In other words, standards aren't protecting women as well as they protect men. Women health workers were also at greater risk because PPE wasn't designed for them. While women makes up about 90% of the nurses in the world, they are at higher risk of infection during the pandemic. According to a global survey on women health workers, only 14% of them can always access PPE that fit their size. And another Canadian survey shows that 85% of the Canadian women workers reported at least one issue with the personal protective equipment they use at work. And this just is not doesn't include just the health worker, but also include women workers in construction and trade. Similar evidence can also be found in the technology sectors. So it's been widely recognized that technology facilitated gender-based violence is becoming a growing threat. Here, research found that in Canada, more than 55% of the domestic violence shelter are serving women who experience technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And another 2021 report from United Nations Population Fund also found that at least 38% of the women globally are experiencing online violence, and this rate is also increasing. So even though technology are supposed to make our life better and easier, and yet they have been used in unintended ways and leveraged in domestic violence. Also, the advancement of AI also enabled easily made deepfake pornography. It used to take hundreds of images to create a convincing deepfake of someone. Now, it only took 2 to 3 images, a very user-friendly applications, and as little as $30 to create an explicit video of someone who doesn't consent to it. Research has found that between 2018 and 2020, the number of online deepfake pornography has roughly doubled every 6 months. And the shocking 96% of this deepfake are sexually explicit and features women who doesn't consent to it. And some of them are just kids or teenagers. So in this last four, a couple of high school students in New Jersey were sued because they create default pornography of their classmates. And at least one of the girls were only 15 years old. And the consequences, like these victims could suffer devastating consequences. The girls might, experience substantial reputational and psychological harm for the rest of their life. According to a survey on Twitter harassment, many women will choose to shut down their social media accounts and stop pursuing public-facing careers such as politics and journalism as a result of the harassment. And in addition, it's also becoming increasingly apparent that the promises of AI doesn't distribute equally, particularly across a few demographic characteristics such as race and gender. So here is a screenshot that I took the other day when I was testing Copilot, the AI tool from Microsoft. And I asked the tool to create a married couple with the husband is Asian and the wife be white. And here is what I got. Does the wife seem white to you? At least not to me. And also I tried to change the comment and asked the tool to replace the white with Canadians or Americans. And I keep getting the similar result. And it doesn't seem that Asian man has a lot of choices. So this is just one of the very common example of how AI can be biased in daily life. So AI bias, which is also a type of algorithm bias, occurs when the algorithm makes decisions that systematically disadvantage certain groups of people because those populations were underrepresented in the data that trained the model, or because the social prejudice were baked into the data itself. And this could have disastrous consequences if those biased algorithms were applied in key areas such as healthcare, criminal justice, or credit scoring. And this is actually already happening. Scientists testing a widely used healthcare algorithm found that the algorithm were severely underestimated the needs of Black patients. And this leads to significant loss of care. And this is not just unfair, but could profoundly be harmful. A couple years ago, Amazon also had to abandon one of their projects trying to create an AI recruitment tool because their engineer found that the tool was discriminating against female applicants, which is not surprising because they used data from the applicants to Amazon in the last 10 years to train the model. And those applicants were predominantly white male. And the algorithm were taught to recognize word patterns instead of skill sets. And the data were also benchmarked to the predominantly male department of the male-dominant engineering department. So it's not surprised that the tool is discriminating female. So people might ask, if AI or the algorithm is biased because they use biased data, can we fix it with more representative data? Unfortunately, the answer isn't that straightforward. And the reality is that this is more than just a glitch. Well, a glitch suggests something that is temporary and can be fixed easily. Sexism and racism are rooted in our society. AI reflects society, and our society is biased against women. So the chart on the right shows a survey from UN that collects data from countries representing 85% of the world's population. And the respondents were asked about multiple biases. Note that they weren't assessing unconscious bias. Instead, they were asking pretty explicit ones, such as whether men or women makes better leader. And the results were terrible. Almost 90% of the world's population, regardless of men or women, has at least one explicit bias against women. So we cannot fix algorithm with better data if the underlying problem is the society, because there aren't better data. So none of these are to imply technology or AI are inherently bad, but we can try to make things better. But we need to be more proactive and have a more holistic approach. Actually, there's already a few international efforts of creating ethical guidance in detecting bias. And there's a lot of discussion on developing standards and testing before a company can deploy a system. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, my colleague Michelle is leading the work of gender responsive standards in the International Standards Committee. And this work starts with the 2016 Gender Declaration from UNECE. So the declaration acknowledged that women are underrepresented in standardization, and then they are not benefiting from standard as well as men. And the purpose of the declaration and its implementation is to provide a practical framework to help any types of standards development organization to create gender responsive standards and to achieve gender balance in their standardization process and environment. Since its release, 86 organizations have signed up the declaration, and as one of the signatory, Standards Council of Canada has also created our action plans and taken an international leadership role in advancing gender responsive standards. So what exactly do we mean by gender responsive standards? According to the UNECE definition, gender responsive standards are standards that acknowledge the distinct needs of different genders and take concerted action to ensure the efficiency of the standards for all. In 2019, both ISO and IEC have signed the Gender Declaration from UNECE. In the following years, they also established the Joint Advisory Strategic Group to deliver their commitment at the international level. Both ISO, IEC, and the UNECE has developed their guidance documents to help standards development organization to develop to create gender responsive standards, and these documents were complementary, both recommending a similar process. And here's what the process looks like. So the flow chart in the left shows the steps that we recommended in inserting gender consideration in the process of standards development. So the idea is to start with the assumption that there could be there could be gender differences in the content of any given standards. Then we collect evidence. The evidence could show that there is no gender differences, there could be gender differences, or the result might be inconclusive. But regardless what the finding is, we argue that these should be documented in the standard documents so that when we come across a standard that doesn't have gender consideration, we would know whether this is the conclusion from a thoughtful process or just potentially an oversight. So we can work through example together. If, for example, we want to develop a testing standards on voice recognition technology, then we will start with the assumption that there are gender differences in this technology. Then we gather the evidence to test our assumption. Indeed, actually, the research found that Google's speech recognition is 13% more accurate for men than for women. So that explains why my Google Home picks up comment from my husband better than mine. And so we found a gender differences in this technology, then we document this finding in the standard and also try to address these issues during the process of standard development so that we can ensure women can enjoy the voice recognition technology as well as men. And this is a generic process that could be applied to any standards. So the idea of gender responsive standard is not to create separate standard although there might be time and places for that. But what we really want is to make sure that women are taken into consideration in the process of standards development, and then women can benefit from the standards as well as men. And one of the very important elements to ensure that we have sufficient consideration of gender is to make sure that we have women on the table. Currently, in Canada, only about 30% of our technical committees are women. And similar rates could be found in ISO and IEC. Though this is not surprising given that many of our technical experts came from the STEM field where women are traditionally underrepresented. But women's participation does make a difference. Research found that more women participating in product development will lead to a more gender responsive products. And as Standards Council, we've also done research indicating that our technical committees actually perform better when there are women on the table. And in addition of bringing more women to the table, what's equally important is to ensure that women can contribute as effective as men. So we are not increasing women's participation for the sake of it, but we need to make sure that we can actually benefit from having women on the table. And by bringing more women on board, we can accelerate the rate of change. So last year, ISO and IEC repeated their gender survey to their technical committees. And this time we see a slight increase, from 25% to 3 years ago to 37% this time, that the technical committee does think gender to some extent relevant to the work of their committees. We are making progress, but it's still a long way to go. As Standards Council, we've also tried to map our national standards of Canada to the 17 SDG goals set by UN. And one of the goals, SDG 5, is about gender equality. And currently, only 2% of our national standards of Canada contribute to SDG 5. And the remaining 98% is not relevant. So we need to do more to advance gender responsive standards. And last but not least, it's, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, gender is not women are not the only group that are systematically disadvantaged. Similar process and consideration should be applied to other marginalized groups to ensure that everyone could benefit the same from standards. So that's all I have to share today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Diane. Are there questions, comments from the audience? Well, maybe a question, comment from my side. So I'm aware that the Ietf has been doing quite a bit of work to improve gender representation, and of course that's a long-term project more than a yes or no success. What recommendations could you give to a place like the Ietf after having a little bit of a grasp of the people and the process?
So I think this process is actually applicable to any standards development organization, any process of standards development. So, well, if you're interested, you can check out the UNEC's website or ISO IEC's website on their work on gender responsive standards. And I've known that Ietf also tried to check the demographic of your meeting participants. So this is a good start. And so we are hoping that more organizations will take actions to promote gender responsive standards and to ensure that not just women but other minority group could benefit the same as the rest of the population.
Thank you. I see Carolina on the queue. Please go ahead.
Thank you for that presentation. I guess I wanted to share a reflection, sort of tying your presentation to the experience of some of us here at IETF, and then ask a question. So I think as you probably noticed, I don't know if you have attended other IETFs before, but maybe just by having a look at who's in the corridors, you can tell we don't have a great female representation. I would say, yeah, women and non-binary participants don't make up a significant, percentage of the people that attend IETF, right? So the point on representation really sort of rung a bell with me, if that makes sense. And I think it's a very sort of important point, and one where I think we're trying hard within this community to sort of have changed. On that point, there's been within this community these very weak conversations about, for instance, the nomcom, and I know there's a presentation on that following this one, the nomination committee here at IETF, and whether we need to sort of work to ensure that space becomes more diverse from a sort of gender perspective. And I think that sometimes in engaging in those conversations, there's a bit of resistance, right? And you hear the classic arguments like, oh, we need to pick the best of the best, like we shouldn't be discriminating on the basis of gender and that kind of thing. So I think there's a clear need for more research in this area. So when we are asking for those changes to processes, we can show evidence of perhaps other areas, and ideally research on standards specifically, where we show these things matter. And that's exactly the question that I had in your about your presentation. So when you spoke about representation, you had some data on product development and how female representation made a difference in that front. And I was wondering whether you have any information or data that's specific to SCOs, so standards development, and how having more women present makes a difference. So yeah, thank
Sure.
you.
So I could expand a little bit on that. So this is the research. I have a link attached to it. It's the research that we've done at Standards Council of Canada. So at Standards Council, we manage our mirror committees that were bringing Canadian representative to the ISO and IEC committees. So we have roughly 400 plus active committee members, and 400 plus active technical committees with over 3,000 committee members. And for each committee, they will have to submit an annual report, and we will score them based on the different performances, the bullets they submitted, all their standardization activity participating in ISO and IEC. And we try to, make a regression to see whether the score differ if there are at least one woman on the table. And it does shows that when there are at least one woman on the table, the scores actually higher. So, which means that having a woman participating in the committee could potentially encourage the committee to perform better. So that's the research that we've done, and that we really wanted to show everyone that gender doesn't make a differences in the standards development process.
Thank you very much. Colin is the next in the queue. Please go ahead. No. Colin is asking a question.
I thought he was the next in the presentation.
No worries.
Right. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, Colin Perkins, Ietf Chair. Thank you, Carolina. I think you made some good points. Thank you, Diane, for the presentation. The statistics are shocking, if not entirely surprising, what you present. I certainly know there was a study conducted in the IETF last year, so looking into the experiences of women in this organization that highlighted a number of issues. I know the IESG is working on trying to respond to that and trying to produce some suggestions for how to improve things. We also have been working on the IRTF Code of Conduct to try and help in this organization. I know we have perhaps a very long way to go, but we are trying, and the leadership is listening and trying to address some of these issues. In terms of the other parts of the presentation, I really liked the questions to consider slide. That seemed like some useful questions which can help in a very operational way to try and work through the issues and make it concrete what we need to do when developing the standards. So I think that was very useful. I will certainly be looking at the report which was cited in the slides and passing that on to others in the organization. So thank you for that.
Thank you for your comments. Nice to hear that you found it useful.
Nick, you're next.
Yeah, Nick Doty, Center for Democracy and Technology. Thank you so much for this presentation and for raising this declaration, which I admit I hadn't seen. And I really appreciate the idea of an action plan that would have to go along with signing that declaration. That seems like a good thing for us to consider. The slide here seems to show something something that I think we have some experience with, like we have review processes in place. Many standards development bodies do, and we could be using a similar process to try to catch issues like that and make standards more responsive. I'm curious if there's similar advice on how to do that at an organizational level. I think Colin was already pointing out that's something IETF and IRTF are interested in, but I think if there is good advice on this is what should be part of an action plan for improving representation or improving the actual process, not just the standards themselves, I think it'd be great to learn from that.
Thank you for your question. So just one thing I need to clarify that at Standards Council of Canada, we don't develop standards. We accredited standards development organizations in Canada. So one of our recommendations in our action plan is that we actually make gender consideration a mandatory requirements for SDOs under our accreditation. So they are asked to insert the gender consideration in their process of the standards development. So that's how we try to promote gender responsive standards as a national standardization body.
Thank you.
Vittorio, you're next.
Hi. Yeah, Vittorio Bertola. Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for bringing this up here. And since I shared your objectives, I think that we all should give a thought on not how to make this, how to bring this out of this room. The people in this room are the ones that care and came here. I think we all share the objective, but the problem is how do we convince the rest of the organization that? So I was wondering whether we the chairs or whatever, could arrange to have a presentation or a discussion on this topic in an IETF plenary or in a broader setting so that we can try to raise the awareness of the problem and try to get them more interested by other parts of the community. However, the other thing I wanted to say to you is that when we do that, you will get pushback because there are parts of this community that think that this is all wrong and there should not be any gender concern in this process. And many of the examples you gave are not examples related to internal standards, are technological examples related, for example, to AI training data sets or implementations, but not to standards. So if we do that, that should be focusing on examples of internal standards that are facilitating any kind of gender diversity or gender-based violence. And there are some, because I think that one of the cases in which this comes up often is whenever we have to set the balance between the confidentiality of communications and the ability to check and stop communications that are not desirable. And in gender-based violence, often the confidentiality of communication is used to harass women. And so that's exactly one of the places where some gender consideration should be advisable in our work. So I think if we focus on specific examples, it will be easier to convince the rest of the community.
Thank you for your advice. Yeah, definitely that's helpful. And so to be honest, this is my first time in the IETF, and this doesn't really fall under the traditional standardization world where ISO IEC are doing. But I think this process is pretty generic that could be applied to any standards development organization. And so we were actively, the Standards Council actively leading the gender responsive work at ISO IEC, and the UNECE declaration, it's actually not limited to any of those national standardization body. So it won't be a bad idea if IETF could consider, take a look up at the UNECE Gender Declaration and to see if you want to become a signatory. And I think it would be a nice thing to promote in IETF.
We have one last question from Bengo.
I like the idea of the accreditation stuff. My understanding in the US where I'm from is that the W3C and IETF are not accredited by the United States government. Is IETF accredited by the Canadian government?
No.
Okay, so yeah, maybe there's room for
Well,
standards
if you want
to
to
differentiate
accredit,
themselves.
check out our website. Yeah, but it will. Well, not if like IETF, because it's not really the one of the traditional type of SDOs. I think what makes more sense is to check the UNEC declaration. That's where everything starts. And there are like globally 86 organizations has already signed the declaration and become a signatory. And so our organization, SCC is one of them. I believe NC and some other national standardization bodies also signed up the declaration, BSI, FNORC. So not quite sure in terms of the technology field, but I'm definitely, IEC is technology focused, and they're also a signatory of the gender declaration.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, like what do you think if someone had an idea for a technical standard or protocol, was happy to standardize it in a number of forums? Like, would you encourage them to take it to an organization that was in solidarity with this report, like explicitly, as a way of like, encouraging innovation in forums that support this versus undermine or ignore it?
So I don't think I'm in the best position to answer that question, because I don't really know or familiar with IETF and what you're doing, because I look at the agenda, over 90% of the content I don't understand. Don't come from a technical background.
I think it happens also to the IETFers.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure how IETF organize and how you manage your technical committee. So I'm not really in a best position to provide advice on how to promote this piece of work in your organization. But definitely check out the gender declaration, which is more generic and recommended to any SDOs.
Very well. Thank you very much, Diane, for the good presentation and a very interesting discussion. Let's thank the speaker.
Thank you.
And next in the agenda, we have, oops, sorry, 1 second. We have Alessandra Loca, who is going to be presenting again on the topic of gender, networks and power, the effects of random selection into NOMCOM. Alessandra Loca is an assistant professor of economics at the Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich. And she received her PhD in economics from the University of Mannheim in Germany in 2020, and her research interests are empirical industrial organization, innovation, and organizational economics. Alessandra, thank you for being here, and the room is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody. You can hear me and see me well, right?
Loud and clear.
Okay. And the way to control the slides, I should be able to control the slides.
Yes, just 1 second. Sorry.
Yeah.
Now you should be able to control the slides.
Okay, good. Okay, so thanks. So greetings from Europe, first of all. Sorry I couldn't be there. It's almost 11 p.m., but the previous discussion made me really awake. So I hope the same is going to be for my presentation. So first of all, this is going to be, so I'm in social science, I'm an economist, and me and my co-authors, we are interested in the organization of the IETF in itself and the standardization process. So this is going to be a project, a talk about trying to understand the internal organization and trying to get some, to infer something about innovation and organizational economics as well. This is a joint work with Bernard, Nicola, Tim, and Emanuele. Bernard is actually in the audience remotely. I'm sure he would be happy to answer any of the questions. And let me also advertise, he also did it already. Speaking of gender, a set of co-authors of mine have paper about balanced gender in non-com and area directors. So there is a link in the comments, so feel free to click on it. Now this paper is going to be about networks and power. And let me try to motivate our research agenda. In general, in economics and social sciences, we're interested in the idea of networks and powers. Powers, what I define as power spillovers. So what is the idea? The idea is when someone in a professional network achieves a position of power, that person gains some bag of knowledge, connections, informal credits that can be used later to increase the entire network professional success. And this is something we're really crazy about in economics. Now, an example that we usually give is if you are in an academic world and if a co-author of yours becomes editor in a journal, this might increase the chances of you being accepted in that journal, so being more powerful. A problem with that is that it is really hard to estimate the pure effect of power as it typically correlates with the characteristics of the individuals holding it. Let me try to be a bit more clear, and let me try to tell you how the IETF comes at help for us. So we're going to look at your organization, and we're going to look at powerful positions, which are the position in non-com. And now we are really happy to hear also your feedback about how we see this kind of process. So this is going to be like power being in non-com. So what we are interested in is looking at whether randomly assigning power to an individual in non-com is going to have favorable effects on the network of this individual selected in non-com, and we're going to compare this with the network of similar individuals not selected into non-com. And I'm going to be very clear about that in a few minutes. So why this is hopefully also interesting for you, because as outputs of these individuals, we're going to look at the production of internet standards and also patents by a subgroup of individuals in the IETF. So here we're going to talk about, I'm going to, try to discuss this whole agenda with you. And in particular in this talk, I'm going to talk about which kind of data we use from the IETF organization and the non-com, the nominating committee. I'm going to tell you a bit about how we construct a data set that links patents to inventors in the IETF. And also I'm going to talk about how we think about the networks in the IETF. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the empirical strategy that we use to conduct this analysis. So also, Ignacio, they can also, the questions are going to be only at the end, or they can interrupt anytime? I don't know how.
You are the boss. It's your call.
I'm happy to get feedback also in between. In Econ, we are always, happy to have feedback. So whenever you have in mind some questions, feel free to ask. Okay, so I don't need to tell you much about the IETF because I'm talking actually with the IETF and I'm very excited about this. Let me tell you a bit how we use your organization. So we look in particular at this nominating committee, non-com, and we think of it as a power kind of committee because the non-com people have the power to appoint the supervisors of the IETF standardization process, the area director. So this is what we define as power. The other thing that is nice about that is that you have this super cool random selection into non-com. So you have this super cool random generating algorithm that draws members from a pool of volunteers. And we're going to leverage this randomness because this is going to be crucial for our empirical analysis. Now, what is kind of the empirical strategy here? What we're going to do is to look at the productivity of co-authors of volunteers that were randomly selected into non-com, and this is going to be our treated group. We're going to compare them with the productivity of co-authors of volunteers who were not randomly selected into non-com. Okay, so our treatment is going to be co-authors of people randomly selected, and control is going to be co-authors of people that volunteered but were not randomly selected into non-com. So what is nice as economists, we are always excited about this random variation, is that the only variation is going to come from this random selection and not from the characteristics of the individuals that hold this power. So let me try to explain you with the graph what we do. So the light blue icons are volunteers in NomCom, and they have a set of co-authors that are, they're surrounded by their set of co-authors. There can be more co-authors, less co-authors. Now, these are the volunteers. Now, let's say that 1 year, for these 2 volunteers, only one gets selected into NomCom. And this is going to be the yellow guy, like say, I highlighted as yellow. And this is going to be a positive shock to all his or her co-authors. So we're going to compare how these people that get this positive shock are going to do in terms of internet standards and patents relative to the co-authors of the guy on the left that did not get this positive shock. Okay, so this is our random variation. This is how we're going to explore this random variation. Okay, so which kind of data we use? We have data about the whole IETF grassroots participation. We have email list servers, 3 annual meetings. We have data about internet drafts, requests for comments. This is all public, so it's not, I mean, we just collected this data. The other thing we do is to consider IETF contributors' names as inventors in the US utility patents, and I'm going to give you more details about that. And we also have data about the networks of NomCom volunteers and selected members. So today I want to grab your attention about these last 2 things: the patents and the network of people, of volunteers. And we are really happy to hear your feedback on how we construct these measures. So let's talk first about patents. We take the universe of patents from 1976 to 2023 from the United States Patents and Trademark Office, the USPTO. And then what is the challenge? So in principle, we need to link these patents to IETF contributors, okay? The challenge is that we need to match them to real IETF contributors. And we might have a problem because in the USPTO data, we have the inventor name and the ID, but in the IETF data, we only have the name of the inventor or the contributor, right? So in case of popular names, such as, Adam Smith, we might incur in the risk of wrongly assigning people to the IETF. What do? We try to pin down to actual IETF members by putting some filters to the patents. So one is, okay, we take these patents, we look at whether there is at least 1 patent in physics, electricity, or new tech developments, or at least 1 patent including terms related to the IETF and to internet. Okay, so we try to restrict the sample of patents to link them to IETF in a reasonable way. And these are the 2 filters we're working on. Obviously, happy to hear more your thoughts. Now, still, there could be multiple matches of IETF contributors and inventors. So what do? We standardize the number of patents by the number of inventor ID. And let me give you an example. Let's take this little man here, Adam Smith. Let's say he has a very popular name. So in the USPTO patents, there are 2 Adam Smiths. One is orange, the other is brown. One has 10 patents, the other has 20 patents. We don't know. We just look at the name. It's just Adam Smith. So what do? We're going to assign to this Adam Smith in the IETF 15 patents. So the average of the patents divided by the number of Adam Smith that pop up into the USPTO. And this is the best way we thought of standardizing the number of patents when there are these multiple matches between IETF contributor and inventor in the USPTO. Obviously, any other idea is welcome. We are very, very happy to hear your thoughts on that. Okay, now let me move to the network construction of the volunteers. What do? We want to have an idea of who is co-author of volunteers. So we look at ITF contributors who wrote at least one draft, one internet draft with a volunteer prior to his or her first volunteering year. Okay, so we take the volunteers, we look at the network, but only before that person volunteered. Now, obviously, there can be multiple volunteers and multiple non-com members associated with a contributor. So in the end, that person is going to enter the network only through the first cohort of volunteer. So we only take the first cohort of volunteer. And from that moment on, the ITF contributor is going to be part of the network. This means that in the end, we ended up with an unbalanced panel of about 25,000 co-author year observations, which pinned down to around 2,400 ITF contributors. And to give you some descriptive stats, and hopefully they're going to make sense for you, if we look at ITF contributors in the sample, meaning in the network of volunteers, we have about 2,400 individuals. So these are the people that are in the network of volunteers. They are connected on average to about 2 volunteers, and they have connection with up to 24 volunteers. So for a single contributor, it's up to 24 volunteers. If we still look at the volunteers, how do their network look like? First of all, the unique volunteers that write at least one draft are 491. We look at from 2005 to 2019. They are connected on average to 14 co-authors, and they can have up to 121 co-authors. Now, this number seems a little bit odd, so we wanted to check whether that's true, but this is what seems to be happening. This is for volunteers. Now, in terms of non-com members, the descriptives are relatively similar. So we have about 115 non-com members that write at least one draft. This is about 15 years. I'm talking here about unique non-com members. They are connected on average to 15 co-authors, and they can have up to 100 co-authors. Okay, so here I'm splitting, and I'm only looking at non-com members. So hopefully these numbers make sense for you, for those who have experience with non-com. Now, one open question like for you would be, would this definition of network make sense for you? Is this robust? And in particular, we were wondering if someone is a co-author with a volunteer only once or only one version of the draft, would you consider that person part of the network, or is it too stretched for you to consider it part of the network? Should we define a measure of intensity of co-authorship? So if you only wrote one draft together or 100 drafts or so on and so forth, should we consider something like that? Or should we only look at co-authors on the RFCs and not on the internet drafts? So these are all like more open questions for all of you. Now, let me finally get to the estimation approach. And I'll show you some results. There is also a gender flavor, but we are still trying to finalize that. So again, what is the treatment? An ITF contributor, part of the network, is treated whenever a co-author gets randomly selected into non-com. What we're interested in is the effect of the treatment coefficient to measure whether randomly assigning power to a volunteer has some favorable effects in terms of productivity of internet standards and patents on the volunteer network compared with the network of volunteers not selected. And we think that ex ante, the effect is not clear. So is it better or worse if a co-author of yours becomes selected into non-com? So let's try to look at so let me first probably explain with an equation the specification we're looking at for those of you who are in social science, and then we can look at the preliminary results that we have. So the regression is relatively straightforward. So the YJT is the number of early RFCs or patents produced by an ITF contributor J in the network. This guy is going to be treated whenever, or this girl is going to be treated whenever the co-author gets selected into non-com, And we also try to understand whether there is a differential effect if a co-author female gets selected into non-com. So this is gamma 2 is gonna measure the differential effect for a female selected into non-com. We're also controlling for the experience of this person in the ITF in terms of age, and then some fixed effects, what we define as individual fixed effects and time fixed effects. So finally, very preliminary results. What are we seeing here? We see that if a co-author of yours becomes selected into non-com, this has favorable effects on your productivity in terms of internet standards. So you're likely to produce more internet standards if a co-author of yours gets selected into non-com. And probably even more interesting, hopefully for the discussion we had before, the differential effect for if a co-author of yours is female and is selected into non-com is positive. It's even larger if a female gets selected into non-com. So this is kind of the overall results. We're talking about an elasticity of 45%, which is not negligible. And this is relatively preliminary, but we wanted to, at least show you some preliminary results. So to conclude, we explored a unique case in the STEM profession, namely in the ITF, in which allocation to powerful positions is random. And we want to know if this power, what we define as power, improves the productivity of co-authors in terms of internet standards. And obviously, we have many things to do. First of all, hearing your thoughts and incorporating your thoughts, work on the empirical analysis, and measure potentially other outcomes. There are many outcomes one could look at in the internal organization of the ITF, but this is part of our agenda. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I really look forward to your questions and thoughts.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. I see Susan in the queue. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation and your hard work. This is a question that I've struggled with myself. You're looking at data which is intensely personal, okay? You're about personal cycles. How do you deal with the issues regarding human subject restrictions and privacy? You're digging into the individual's private materials, and you have restrictions about approved consent, a knowing approved consent for those people in your study. How do you deal with that? I struggle with the desire to know the same things, and I don't know how to do a method that looks at gender and demographics without impacting.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for the question. I think this deserves I guess a bigger discussion, and probably we should keep in touch about that. So so in economics, we are we are usually dealing with these dimensions, and it's pretty normal to look at gender and characteristics of individuals. So obviously, let me say, this is going to be all anonymized in terms of whenever we're going to go further with the analysis and publish the paper. So but this is data that it's public, right? So we take data from the ITF data tracker sources, and to the extent that this is public data, and we are trying to understand interesting things about gender and network and stuff, we believe that it's important to do I guess this is more of an open question. We believe it's important to dig into these things and to understand in order to understand the internal organization of the ITF and how things works and how innovation proceeds. How to deal with that? I don't think we have found a good way so far. And again, Susan, we are happy to hear your thoughts on how to deal with this issue.
Because once you take the methodology you have to go down to the individual and the people they relate to. And you have some things which are really against privacy in each one of our lives. You know, how many things have we done? How many patents have we filed? It's a difficult thing to research.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
your methodology reads exactly on
Yeah.
going into what each person is doing and
Yeah.
what patents they've written and what's their business relationship as far as the patents. It's a
Yeah.
hard subject to research, an important one, but
Yeah.
how do you get a methodology?
I agree with you. Like again, like I don't have probably a good answer to it. And I mean, Bernard, if you are in the audience, you feel free to speak as well about that. But we can discuss. We are super happy to discuss more. I agree that it's a kind of an ethical point that we should discuss. Thanks.
Rudiger, please go ahead.
Hi, Rüdiger Volk. I attended my first IETF more than 30 years ago and have been involved with some of the technical work, and only after something like 32 years of participation, I think I published my first RFC. I would like to comment on the underlying assumptions or suggestions from what I'm hearing from you. I think for my history, I participated in the NOMCOM one time, so I have insight how things worked in that year. In other years, it may have been completely different. I think calling the NOMCOM a point of power is actually a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation. I think the NOMCOM is kind of powerful in the way as in the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, the juries are. And what I would say is the NOMCOM does not improve your ability and your opportunities for networking. The regular working group work
I see.
actually is much more powerful in that direction. And when I looked at the volunteer lists, I'm always, and also on the selected NOMCOM members, I'm always surprised how large the percentage of names immediately remember me of certain works and work and contribution.
Yeah.
So kind of whether something is so kind of the people who are involved already are very deeply networked usually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I somewhat suspect that the statistical analysis is interesting, but maybe actually showing correlations that are actually a consequence of very different things happening that are not observed in that research.
Thanks, Rudiger. So let me try to see whether I understand. So also, Ignacio, how much time do I have? I don't want to take too much.
We have 2 more questions, and probably we should cut it there.
Okay. So maybe can I just quickly respond to Rudiger before we go ahead? Yeah. So first of all, very much appreciated. We wanted to know, whether this sort of power concept was how it was taken in terms of non-com. And it's good to hear that, you know, it's not the power we typically think about that non-com gives you. Let me say that we only look at volunteers and the co-authors of volunteers. So we know that these are already people that are, volunteers are usually people that are already highly prominent in the organization. And that's why we try to compare their network only within their network. So we are not looking at, you know, non-volunteer IETF contributors. So again, maybe we can, you know, keep in touch and discuss more this, but you know, it's important that we set the same definition of power or whatever that is on non-com, because, you know, this is going to be crucial for our analysis. And certainly we can look at other things that are more unobserved in terms of correlation of, you know, these volunteers and, you know, these non-com members, and see, you know, everything that brings in the discussion of you know, productivity and measures of outputs that we can think of. But thanks.
Colin?
Hi, Colin Perkins. Firstly, thank you for doing the study. I thought this was really interesting. I thought the idea of using the random selection in the non-com process to debias things was really clever. I thought that was a really nice way of doing it. I'm not entirely sure I agree with Rutger's analysis views on the non-com. Certainly, being selected for the non-com clearly gives you power. It's perhaps a diffuse and indirect set of power, but it clearly gives you power. Am I right in understanding that you looked at the productivity of the co-authors of people selected for the non-com rather than the people selected for the non-com themselves?
Exactly. So we look at the productivity of co-authors, of volunteers, and then the only random variation is going to be whether your co-author gets selected or not.
Yes.
Into non-com. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I think it would be interesting to also look at the productivity of the volunteers. That way we can perhaps resolve this disagreement between Rutger and I and see if this actually does help and provide a certain amount of power or a benefit. So I would encourage you to look at the productivity of volunteers as well as the co-authors.
That's great. Yeah. No, thanks. Thanks. That's super interesting. We will definitely. Thanks. Thanks.
Bengo, please.
Hey, this is really cool. All the algorithmic fairness research is always fascinating, and I think it's great to have like diversity of educational experience in the room here and modeling techniques and stuff. Yeah, I guess my only reaction is that defining productivity is hard and sort of culturally contextual. The choice here of defining it along one dimension of like patents makes sense to me as like one component, but I would kind of, you know, challenge that patents are the most productive, best metric of productivity. They're really useful for a number of things that are like productivity of financial outcomes. So like the Dutch sandwich is something that PricewaterhouseCoopers invented in the 2010s. That was a tax avoidance scheme that was predicated on a lot of patents. And so like a lot of tech companies acquired a lot of patents and then didn't have to pay their fair share of the tax bill. So it's productive from a financial or like profit oriented metric. And so it's like, I don't think it doesn't belong there at all, but I'd be really interested in asking around what other people consider as productive and making that more of like a multidimensional metric, because especially how the randomness affects different like assumptions of what productivity means would be really illustrative. Maybe it doesn't help with some things. Maybe it really helps with things that aren't patents that are potentially even more important, like customer happiness or environmental outcomes, or you know, one thing in the earlier session of like specs and standards could make predictions about the impact on gender, really the impact in general. We could define productivity as, are we learning how to make accurate predictions and hypotheses about the impact of our work on the world? That's the productivity like I'm really interested in. And a lot of business management scientists, et cetera, economists define productivity that way. And patents is just like a sort of rough measure.
Yeah, thanks. This is great, Bengo. Thanks. I think this is exactly what we were looking at in terms of other outcomes or whatever definition of productivity you have. But that's fantastic. Thanks everybody.
Thank you very much. And while Lydia joins and I start sharing her slides, a thought question. You control for age. Oh, well.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
You control for age. We were doing some analysis, and we see that in general, the productivity of a member of the community increases with time, which of course makes sense, more draft, more emails, and so on. So I was thinking that probably it makes sense to control for that rather than the age. The first year that someone joins the ITF or something similar to that, even though probably are correlated.
Sorry, the age for us is the ITF age. Sorry, I was not clear about that. That's exactly what we're doing. Exactly. So we start the first year the person joins the ITF.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alessandra, for the very interesting presentation and discussion. Thank the speaker. And now we have Kalija Jong, who is going to be talking about the ARC Regenerative Communities Protocol. And I let you make your own bio because it's very long.
Great, thanks. Can my colleague Day sit here?
Yes, of course.
So I'm going to share about the research that my colleague Day and I are doing as part of Summer of Protocols in the 2024 cohort. This is my bio. I have been working on digital identity for almost 20 years. I am also an expert in group process and do a lot of event design and facilitation for professional technical communities to get the most out of their face-to-face time together. So I have a lot of process expertise. And my colleague Day is a programmer and wears many hats and is also a community builder, looking at building space for people to be together on land. And we've been dialoguing about themes we're touching on here for almost 2 years. We put in a proposal and were accepted to be part of Summer of Protocols 2024. This is a new effort. We are in the second summer. Last summer, they produced an amazing body of work about protocols, and Tim from Summer of Protocols is in the audience if you want to talk to him later. So we're studying this community. I first attended the ITF last summer and was super impressed by the processes and the way the community operated. And we want to explore how the IETF is kept alive by the energy of the people and their decision to actively contribute their energy to the creation of the protocols here. And one of the coolest thing about this organization is that it's recursive. So the organization is using its protocol processes to develop the protocol processes for developing protocols, right? Like it's all woven together. It's not constitutional documents that that define how things operate, and then the outputs, they're all woven together. So we're looking at the organization differently than many other researchers are, and we aren't writing a PhD thesis. We're doing a summer project. So the IETF has protocols for protocol creation, and we're looking at those protocols through a regenerative lens. And also considering, I've read probably 400 or 500 pages of the history of the IETF, critical points where the processes changed and innovated and sort of why. So what is regeneration? Regeneration is a characteristics of living systems which both grow, generate, and degenerate. And this framework emphasizes that regenerative systems maintain a positive reinforcing cycles of well-being within and beyond themselves. In this diagram, you can see some of these core elements in the middle. This is taken from a paper about the regenerative lens. reflexivity, mutualism, agency, and diversity are all present in the IETF. Where do I point the clicker? There, okay. So we are using these two pattern languages as sources of regenerative patterns to have definition of what we're looking for. And then you might ask, what is a pattern language? So the first one was developed by Christopher Alexander and the folks working with him to help define and get at the quality without a name that makes building and our built environment feel alive. There's 253 patterns in this original pattern language, and they're all networked together. So there's patterns that are connected. It was brought into many other fields, including computer programming, and there is an annual conference about pattern languages that happens. So the GroupWorks deck is a pattern language that I was part of helping develop. A community of facilitators worked on defining it, and its focus was to really get at the core of when we're in a meeting or at a gathering and it's going well. Thank you. How do we know it? Like, what's going on in those meetings? So this pattern language has 9 different core categories, and I decided to pull out many of the flow cards. So flow, at group events, they have a rhythm and a flow to them, both anticipating the event and in response to emerging circumstances. Pay attention to the energy and pacing, and let this influence your decisions, when to do what, and how long, and how often. And if we just go with what I shared there, there's a lot of thought and depth into the arc of these week-long meetings, and they keep getting iterated so that they improve over time. These are some more flow patterns. And when I was at meetings in San Francisco and Prague, and I came home and I reflected on my experience, almost all of these patterns were happening in some way, and usually in a pretty high-performant way. Like reflection and action cycle, balancing structure and flexibility, preparedness. Everybody has to like do all their work the week before to read the drafts to get ready to be in the meetings. There are, as I said, 9 different categories: relationship, modeling, inquiry and synthesis, context, intention, perspective, creativity, and faith. So we're still figuring out how to exactly use the patterns, but so far we have the patterns listed in a document and are noting sort of where we're seeing them happening. There's also the WISE democracy pattern language, which Tom Atlee and the Co-Intelligence Institute folks developed. And I'm in their advisory circle and have known Tom since the year 2000. We're really thinking about how do power, participation, and wisdom come together to help democracies work well. This is a mapping of all the patterns based on where they fit into that framework. And I pulled out some cards to look at, and it's very interesting. We were just talking about NOM-COM, but NOM-COM is a combination of sortition in terms of selecting it, which is a pattern that's found in WISE democracies, and deliberation, because the NOM-COM deliberates on who should fill leadership roles. And it also helps constrain power, partly because leadership rotates throughout the organizations, like in terms of who's in the leadership positions, but also NOM-COM changes every year, right? These are just a few more patterns that I thought would be fun to share with you. Proposals and outcomes are emergent, and the organization is pretty good at metabolizing polarization. But there's 96 patterns in the deck, and many of them are present, and we think are present, and we're exploring them. So this is what we're exploring in our research. And maybe if you have some answers you want to share with us here when we get to questions and answers, that would be great. How can the organization have no official membership and clear coherence? This is one of the wow, okay, figured something out. What are the patterns that are present to make this work? How are these patterns instantiated? Patterns are a high-level way to sort of see the world, but then what specifically is done in making different patterns real? How do they work and weave together? How does the IETF cultivate a group mind and collective intelligence? Could the IETF and its antecedents be considered the original DAO, decentralized autonomous organization? There's a lot of reinventing the wheel going on in the DAO space, which may not need to happen if they learned from practices here. And we're thinking about how other organizations who are working on protocols can take away from our research. There are also many organizations that are concerned about how the internet is governed and how the IETF does its work. Our hope is that this research can help some of them see the value and unique and innovative structure of the IETF. And then hopefully the IETF can learn something from our research and understand itself better. So if you have a story to share or know someone who does about a key process innovation within the IETF, reach out, or anything else that you think based on what we shared. We'd love to hear from you. This is our contact information. And we actually have a research jury. Tim is on it. Key, who was in last year's cohort, and Rosa Zubizarreta.
Zubizarreta.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. She's got a PhD in organizational development, and we went to her first and I said, look, we want to take the patterns and use them as a lens. Do you know anybody who's used this method for doing research before? And she said, no, but it's a totally legitimate research methodology. And she agreed to help advise us this summer. So with that, we'll take any questions folks have or thoughts.
Thank you very much. Are there questions? Then maybe more of a comment than a question. Well, looking forward to see what is the outcome of your research, and maybe when you have it, you can let us know, share it in the RAS mail list, and maybe even present it here again.
Okay, great. And I brought both decks of cards if anyone wants to look at them afterwards. I'm happy to let you do so.
Thank you very much. And our last presentation of the session is from Robert Gell about ActivityPub. So talking about W3C for a change, a non-standard standard. Robert is the Ontario Research Chair of Digital Governance for Social Justice at the York University in Toronto. And his current book, Move Slowly and Build Bridges, Mastodon, the Fediverse, and the Struggle for Ethical Social Media, is under contract with the Oxford University Press. And he has other books, and you can check all this information in the agenda. And with that, Robert, the room is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Ignacio. Thanks for inviting me to be here. Happy to be here. It's my first IETF. And as Ignacio mentioned, I'm going to talk about ActivityPub, and this is based on the second chapter of my book, which focuses on Mastodon and the Fediverse, which should be out from Oxford in 2025, early 2025. Just by way of background, ActivityPub is a W3C recommendation or standard produced by the Social Web Working Group. They were active, as you can see, 2014 to 2018. And they had in their charter basically 3 tasks ahead of them. One being a JSON-based syntax for social data, so I call that the social syntax, a client-side API, and a web protocol for federating social information. That would be ActivityPub. And as I'll talk about, the web protocol for federating social information was actually seen as optional because this was kind of a tiered approach. That federation protocol, ActivityPub, is what underpins and kind of provides a technical underpinning of the Fediverse. And you might be familiar with Mastodon. That's the most popular Fediverse ActivityPub implementation. I guess if we exclude Threads, and we can talk about Threads in a bit. But there's also other systems like PixelFed, which is kind of like Instagram, or PeerTube, which is kind of like YouTube. And there's blogging platforms that are emerging, dating apps, and other applications appearing in this space. And just a little bit of background here, ActivityPub is kind of like email in that it treats actors as having inboxes and outboxes. So messages get pushed out or pulled in, posted out and pulled in that manner. As you probably know, Mastodon gained a lot of popularity. Well, the next slide's not going.
Yeah, sorry, it's my bad. I think I did something silly.
Oh, okay. Mastodon gained a lot of popularity after Elon Musk bought Twitter. That was in October 2022, and you see this massive spike of people who either have left Twitter for Mastodon or try it out and so on. Since then, the reporting has said the monthly active user base is down, which I think misses the point that the ActivityPub Fediverse went through this massive stress test and really came through pretty well, all things considered, and their user base is much higher than it was prior to Musk's purchase of Twitter. So what I'm talking about today draws on multiple sources. We've had some questions about methodology already. I did engage in informed consent-based interviews with ActivityPub developers, Mastodon developers, and members of the Social Web Working Group. I also read all of the Social Web Working Group meeting minutes. Those minutes are considered public in W3C's privacy and confidentiality standards. And I'm drawing on my training, engaged in software studies and science and technology studies, analysis of ActivityPub and Mastodon. So self-hosting Mastodon, administering Mastodon, using the software and seeing how it works. I'm going to start with a little incident that shows the non-standard nature of ActivityPub. And it comes from one of the authors, Amy Guy. And as Guy told me in an interview, they were working on a dissertation at the University of Edinburgh in early 2010s. And they were working on the semantic web, and they were kind of bored by the topic. So like any good PhD student, myself included, they were procrastinating on writing this dissertation. And they were clicking around the W3C website and saw Social Web Working Group and said, oh, what's this? They clicked on that and clicked on what happens if I join the group? Clicks on join the group, and lo and behold, they become a member of this Social Web Working Group. And this is all kind of accidental because they didn't know at the time, as they told me, that you had to be a member of an organization that was a member of the W3C. And fortunately, University of Edinburgh was. So Guy was able to join the Social Web Working Group kind of through this accidental procrastination process. So if there's a standard way to join a standards body, Guy's way really wasn't it, although maybe many of you have stories about stumbling into standards in the same way. But we're lucky that Guy did, because Guy went on to write or be a co-author of one of the most important W3C standards of the past decade, in my view, ActivityPub, joining 4 other people. Now, this non-standard approach kind of grates against received wisdom we might have about standards. Here I'm citing Ken Kretschmer, who founded a journal called Communication Standards Review, who has this kind of idealized, progressive, technical, modernist understanding of how standards get produced. And frankly, Diane's presentation earlier, some of the quotes from that replicated that this is not really about bodies in a room, it's about, you know, technical progress that's kind of above and beyond human bodies in a room. So we talk about standards bodies, but we don't talk about embodied people making standards. But if we contrast that view with sociological and historical studies of standards like that of Andrew Russell or Susan Lee Starr, or the essays collected in this book, we see that actually, you know, standards production is very messy, and I'm sure many of you can attest to that. And so that's kind of where I'm placing my work, is looking at the messy embodied way that ActivityPub came to be. So with that in mind, some of the non-standard aspects of ActivityPub: one, no corporate social media were involved in the production of ActivityPub, which is quite odd. Social Web Working Group produced 7 standards, and you know, I looked at many other W3C standards bodies. Typically, they're going to put out 1 or 2 standards. ActivityPub itself, which again arguably is the most important standard to come from this group, almost did not happen. And even though it did happen, most of the world ignores half of it. So let me talk about the first one, which is that this group was small beans, that there were no corporate social media involved in the Social Web Working Group. And if I asked you to think of which corporate social media should be represented in a group making open social standards for the social web, you might think Meta or Facebook, you might think Twitter, you might think Google, you might think Sina Weibo. And the Social Web Working Group thought of all those too and invited all of them to join, and none of them showed. Twitter was especially courted, and Twitter basically just didn't show up. So people weren't coming to the Social Web Working Group from these corporate entities. And this is not standard. If we look at the work of Andrew Russell et al., as they note in their history of digital standards, many companies, incumbents and startups alike, commit resources and people to create standards. Employees take substantial time to attend meetings, draft and review documents, lead committees. Standards work feeds into corporate strategies for purchasing and manufacturing information processing equipment. Now, the authors of ActivityPub are not affiliated with any corporate social media companies. And outside of some early involvement from a representative from IBM and a representative from Boeing, the Social Web Working Group really didn't have major corporate involvement. As one of the ActivityPub authors put it in an interview later, Christine Lemmer-Weber said, "We were like the only standards group at the W3C that didn't have corporate involvement. None of the big players wanted to do it," which begs the question, why? In my book, I offer the theory that it has to do with open social. So in 2007, Google convened many Facebook competitors to create the Open Social Foundation. As its name implies, it was a project similar to what the Social Web Working Group would go on to do, create an open standard by which multiple social media sites can interoperate. So this has a who's who of late 2000s social media: Google, Yahoo, Friendster, 6apart, Ning, Bebo, High Five, and MySpace. And the reporting in the business press at the time found that Facebook was caught off guard by the Open Social Foundation. And this leads to a bit of a conflict between Facebook, MySpace, and Google, and so on. And if you look at subsequent open social standards meetings, you see a hesitancy to join. And so, as Amy Guy told me, none of the big players, no one took us seriously. No one saw the social WG as the threat. No one expected it to go anywhere. The feeling was it was small beans and it wasn't worth their time. Now, this leads to the second non-standard aspect of this, which I call standardize all the things. Again, typical W3C bodies produce 2 recommendations or standards. The Social Web Working Group produces 7, listed here on the left. And I think this relates back to lack of corporate involvement. It's a bit of a mixed blessing. Without corporate involvement, the members of the group were free to indulge various whims in terms of social media standardization. On the other hand, the absence of corporate social media involvement maybe had the group be a little less grounded in terms of their outcomes. And so a way that was put to me by Evan Prodromo in my interview with him, most of the social web working group participants were either open source enthusiasts or people coming from an academic or theoretical background. So a lot of it was kind of witchcraft, right? It's the imaginary world we can have rather than how do I get more users onto a corporate social network. Looking at the meeting minutes based on my interviews, there are three distinct groups really involved in the social web working group. Solid, that's a project that was talked about earlier today. The brainchild of Tim Berners-Lee, a very academic approach to standardizing social media practices. IndieWeb, which was a significant faction in the social web working group, having their publish on your site and syndicate everywhere approach, a very website specific approach. And then there were people with a background in federated social media. So people like Wilkie, who created rStatus, Christine Lemmer-Weber, who created Media Goblins, Evan Prodromo, who helped create oStatus. So as Guy told me, as you can imagine, with these different groups, it went around and around in circles. No one could agree because everyone was invested in their own option. There were few places where people would not compromise. There are always things that nobody would budge on. So how does this get resolved? Well, eventually the group comes to the conclusion we should standardize all the things, standardize all the approaches. And as Guy said, that basically unblocked us. All of a sudden, people were at odds with each other, were helping each other out, navigating the W3C process, consulting each other with technical expertise. The whole dynamic changed after that. And as Bengo put it to me in an interview, I almost want to say we succeeded too much. We produced almost too many standards. So non-standard 3, I think this is very important for the history of ActivityPub and Mastodon, and that is ActivityPub. Again, arguably the most important standard to emerge from this group, almost didn't happen. This was a meme that was shared in the social web working group meeting minutes. What if we close without a recommendation? The Federation protocol kept getting pushed back. And again, partially that could be due to the fact that it was seen as optional. But we see this again and again in meeting minutes. Stop trying to make Federation happen. It's not going to happen. We're not going to be able to pull this off for a variety of reasons. However, fortunately for us, Federation had a passionate ally, and that's Christine Lemmer-Weber, who put a tremendous amount of energy into creating what would go on to be ActivityPub. Now, Lemmer-Weber is a relatively junior member of the group, and if I look at the minutes, to be honest, mostly who's opposing Lemmer-Weber's work is the co-chair of the group, Tandik Selek. And I reached out to Selek for an interview and haven't heard back. But I think it's fair to say from the meeting minutes that Selek was less invested in Federation. This is a representative quote from another group member who presented about the group during the group's production. And this was a common sentiment that Selek would say. It's like, I don't really care about Federation. I'm interested in pushing out my content to my friends, and Federation is kind of besides the point in that regard. So it's optional, time is running out, things are looking very bleak for a Federation protocol. What could possibly rescue it but Mastodon? Now, remember that in the lack of corporate social media involvement, anyone who comes along and implements something from this group would be kind of de facto a big player. And Mastodon came along and implemented an early version of ActivityPub. Mastodon was gaining traction in 2017 as a queer-friendly or Nazi-free social networking Twitter alternative. Mastodon took up ActivityPub because oStatus, which was the protocol it was running on, didn't really cut it for queer and marginalized and trans members. Mastodon could federate with GNU Social, which is another federated system, via oStatus, and they had very different visions of privacy and messaging. In Mastodon, they tried to implement privacy flags on messages, but GNU Social instances would ignore those and basically publicize those private posts and thus put marginalized people in danger. And Christine Lemmer-Weber knew this and said to Eugen Rochko and other folks involved with Mastodon, we can solve that with ActivityPub and message addressing. So as Lemmer-Weber would go on to argue, there's this shared queer and trans history between ActivityPub, Mastodon. Both of them had interests in safety and privacy and federated social media. So Mastodon goes on to implement an early version of AP And in the absence of a major corporate implementation, Mastodon was the largest on the block. And this impressed the members of the W3C, who started their own Mastodon server in 2017. Amy Guy told me they helped set this up. But even with all that going on, time was running out for ActivityPub. So here we get to another non-standard aspect of everything. The social web working group charter was set to end in mid-2017. You might remember from early on, it ended in 2018. Mastodon bought it time. W3C granted extensions to the social web working group to push things back into early 2018 and give Christine Lemmer-Weber, Amy Guy, Evan Pedromo, Jessica Fallon, and Aaron Shepard time to finalize the standard and push things over the goal line. So then you get it published in early 2018. And as an aside, I just want to put this in a context. I just read this fantastic book by Avery Dame Griff, talks about the transgender history of the internet, and how trans communities have contributed to internet development over the past 30 years. And I would argue that ActivityPub and Mastodon could be another chapter in this story. Finally, I'll talk quickly about non-standard 4 and the fact that half of ActivityPub is ignored. An easy source to figure that out is to look at Darius Kazemi's highly opinionated guide to learning about ActivityPub, where Kazemi says, look, ActivityPub is actually two protocols. One is a server-to-server protocol, and that's the thing that structures, a Mastodon server communicating with a PixelFed server to a PeerTube server. But it's also a client-to-server protocol, and that could structure a client connecting to the broader Fediverse. And Kazemi says, ignore the client-to-server half, everyone else does. Nobody really implements the client-to-server part. And that's kind of a shame because the social web working group members, almost to a person, told me the client-to-server part's actually their favorite bit. But again, this is due to Mastodon. While Mastodon saves ActivityPub, Mastodon also brought its own API to the game, and they didn't adopt the ActivityPub client-to-server protocol. They used their own API. And that makes sense at the time, and people start to adopt similar APIs for PixelFed and PeerTube and so on. The danger is, and I mentioned thread earlier, threads, is that Mastodon is no longer the big player on the block. Threads is. Threads from Meta is adopting ActivityPub to federate, and by de facto that makes Threads the biggest API developer in this space. But Threads is another chapter altogether in my book. I'm going to move to my conclusion, and I have three main points that I'm taking away from this. One is ActivityPub and the Fediverse have largely been developed outside corporate social media logics. It's not just that the ActivityPub didn't really have corporate social media involvement. If we look at the subsequent Fediverse, much of it is what I would call non-capitalist in its political economy. People do donations, they run nonprofits. That's a pretty dominant model, and it's largely refused the political economy of behavioral advertising, which is used across the rest of the internet. But related to that, ActivityPub development did take a tremendous toll on its creators. Amy Guy, in their interview with me, told me, I have PTSD, I don't really ever want to get involved in standards ever again. Christine Lemmer-Weber is somewhat hesitant to talk about her time in the social web working group publicly, but she has publicly said it took years off her life. Even Evan Pedromo, who I thought would be the most kind of triumphant of the lot, because he's still working with ActivityPub, told me he felt a sense of trauma based on this experience. And I think that relates to a lack of support that people might have felt in ways that maybe people who have some sort of sponsorship or funding or employment, steady employment, don't feel. And the final thing to note is obviously ActivityPub is an open standard. It's currently evolving, but its governance is a little unclear. And Threads, again, Meta's Threads is adopting it, but reports from folks who are maintaining ActivityPub now, they tell me that Threads and Meta are not really getting involved in the day-to-day discussions about maintaining ActivityPub. So with that, I'll stop and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the very interesting presentation. Do we have questions? Maybe while people think about their questions, one question from my side. So what lessons would you take away in the sense that on the one hand, WB3C, I would say, had a positive aspect in that it created a room and a space for, let's say, deviants to create something that was successful, implemented and working. And on the other hand, so how we enable that more, and on the other hand, how we ensure that people are not crushed by the way in which the society is made.
Yeah, that's a really important question. I don't know what might be generalizable from this case without more study of the same sort of standards production. Like, I hesitate to go off of this one case, but I do think that it's important in the history of the Fediverse to look at these non-corporate origins and then non-corporate practices. At the very least, you see a tremendous amount of resistance to surveillance capitalism as a whole. And so maybe one implication is, can you carve out spaces for people to build standards without those sorts of profit-driven motives, possibly? But I don't know how you do that and still have major meetings in expensive cities and people flying from all over the world to gather. I mean, that's very challenging.
Thank you. Colin?
Hi, Colin Perkins. I would hope we have learned something from all the standards activities during the pandemic about how to run these things without having to have everyone flying around the world. Although having flown around the world to come to this meeting, I'm not sure we necessarily have. But we're making progress, I think. I think what struck me here is, even though it's such a different type of standard to a lot of the work we do in the IETF, and the W3C works in such a different way to the IETF, the comments about half the standard being ignored and taking years off people's lives, I think a number of people would say the exact same thing about a number of IETF standards. So the parallels are interesting. So yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting talk, and please follow IETF and IRTF on Mastodon.
Yeah, and maybe that is a generalizable point, is to look at the impacts that standards contributions have on people, deleterious or positive, and ask how to mitigate, the stress and trauma of this sort of activity. I'm an academic first and foremost, and so a lot of this I transfer over to the pressures of publish or perish. I think the similar pressures must be felt in these standards bodies as well.
Andrew?
Hi, Andrew Campling. Thanks for the really interesting presentation. I just really had two thoughts on the whole precious and taking years off your life thing. I wonder, some of the research we've done here on the culture tells us that maybe there's a common thread about badly behaved cultures across the standards bodies who, I think, let's face it, many of them have a very poor sort of reputation externally for the internal cultures. So just that one thought. And then secondly, on the lack of involvement of the established players, you explained maybe one of the reasons why. I wonder if the real one was perhaps because they like the network effect and like proprietary and don't like openness, because where's the incentive for them in that? They quite like the status quo.
Yeah, I glossed over that, but absolutely, I talk about that at length in the book, that we are seeing the Fediverse is distinct from the established players, with the exception, obviously, of Threads. Threads is an interesting case that needs to be observed, but it's decidedly not the classic walled garden. I forget, your first point was about the years off the life, and to connect that up with the Fediverse writ large too, I also have documented, and this is not going to surprise anybody, tons of burnout from the largely voluntary moderation and admin force of the Fediverse. And this is a big question when you get together with Fediverse admins and moderators, is how to sustain and support people who are facing burnout from a very, very difficult job.
Hi, thanks so much for this. I wanted to invite you to come to the FEDI forum that I collaboratively organize with Johannes Ernst, which is where people who are building the Fediverse with Mastodon mostly, but also we've invited Threads to come. And the next one's, it's all virtual, so you don't have to fly anywhere. And it's September 14 to 17.
Mm-hmm.
And then building on this point about that you're talking about the emotional toll, I think there's a paper that was written last summer as part of Summer of Protocols called Standards Make the World. Standards are fundamental for shaping so much, right? They're standards that make the door, and like everything in this room is shaped by standards, right? They're core to our world. But civil society has underinvested in paying people to show up and participate. And then they like to complain later. And I think it would be great to figure out how we use some of your research, some of the history of the impact that standards make, and convince some civil society groups that actually paying people, for example, Daniel Kahn-Gilmer is paid by the ACLU and paid to show up and contributes actively and is amazing. There should be 30 or 40 people like that here. There isn't. And civil society should have contributed to the emotional well-being and financial well-being of people building Activity Pub, because the corporations weren't doing it, but it shaped the world. Anyway, so hopefully we can figure out how to improve the narrative so that there's more sources of money contributing to standards creation, humans, than just the corporate ones.
Here, and yeah, I've attended FETI Forum in the past. Probably will be there again. So.
Thank you, Kalia. Bengo, you are next. We have about 5 minutes left, so if everybody can make their comments in a concealed fashion, so everybody has a bit of time to make their point, that could be awesome.
Yeah, so as one interesting detail that was omitted is the detail that Activity Streams 2 actually was an IETF work item before it got taken to W3C.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I was talking to James Snell, who's now at Cloudflare 6 months ago or so, asking why did you do that? And at the time he was saying he was at IBM, and the thought was, well, the corporate social media companies tend to hang out over there with the web. We should probably do it over there, and maybe we'll get more or something. Which it kind of looks like they didn't, but hey, it's an understandable motivation. But and the other thing I want to touch on is how you said most of the group wasn't since you mentioned capitalism, let's talk about that. I was actually there not as a deviant, to use the chair's words.
Sorry for the word. I was
I'm
trying to express myself rather than.
But as for my job, so I think I joined sort of halfway through, and I worked for a real-time comments section company that made widgets underneath everyone from CNN to Fox News to AmericanIdol.com to The Sun in the UK, et cetera. And what we were hearing from them is someone's got to save the news from these corporate social media companies. Yeah. We're not going to have any news if no one does anything. And so I guess I want to share those two details and juxtapose this notion of what we think we should do as when we are in our corporate technologist hats, and who we're supposed to talk to make our to get promoted, versus to the civil society, what things we need, and who, how that informs which forums we take things to and who we involve in the process. The last thing I want to highlight is last year at TPAC and W3C, there was a disagreement. There's a proposal to reincorporate the working group of W3C, which tends to be corporate members only plus invited experts, and there's usually not that many of them, though I was one in the past. And the proposal was a last-minute one at TPAC, even though it should have been on the agenda 2 weeks ahead of time per W3C process. And the proposal was not there was not consensus in the surprise proposal at the in-person conference. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's another proposal like that in Anaheim this year in 1 or 2 months. So one of the things the community is talking about is is the status quo of an open community group governance pretty good? We're in the social web community group at W3C. Should the W3C vote to take it into a working group with more limited membership and more centralized control? Or who knows, maybe actually it could come back to IETF and there could be more IETF-ish work in a regenerative sense. Do you have any, and if you have any thoughts, please share.
Oh, I could talk for a long time about journalism and social media, but we don't have enough time. But yeah.
Dave?
First, Bengo, I think it's a great idea for it to come back. Second, if anybody's interested in actually reading the Standards Make the World essay that Kalia mentioned, I have it here in paper. It's also true that this protocol improvement grant program for the Summer of Protocols is supporting work by Evan Prodromo and Tom Coates to get end-to-end encryption integrated with ActivityPub, which is cool. So the work does continue and is finding some support and probably needs even more support. So just re-saying a lot of what Kalia already said. And yeah, I mean, obviously the sources of funding for things are going to determine the kind of outcomes that we get for the things. So if we want civil society outcomes, we need civil society funding for sure.
Thank you. Susan?
2 questions. It sounds like you had conflict, and it sounds like you had pushing toward togetherness. What were the metrics that you used in your ethnographhy or your qualitative analysis for that?
So how I approached this as an outsider looking in was first read all the minutes and take extensive notes and try to map out arguments or conflicts or points of consensus among the group as well as I could, but not at the same time I was trying not to assume conflict or consensus. Just try to get a mapping, and that took a very long time because I forget how many documents there are. Plus there are IRC logs and other things to look at as well. And then I took that to members of the social web working group like Bengo and Wilkie and others to check my knowledge against their recollection. And then over time, I was able to develop a sense of patterns. I was hearing the same things from different groups of people, from different camps, as it were. I hesitate to use that word, but camps I think is fair. And after that point, it snapped into place the kind of moment. You can almost see it in the minutes when it's just, let's standardize all of this. And then you start to see this rapid progression as you go minute to minute, where people are rapidly moving through the stages of producing a recommendation. So it's kind of that iterative process of working my way through the notes, through interview data, then back through the notes, and checking things constantly with people. Does that help?
In it, did you come to some sort of common methodology, common summarization of what conflict meant in that group, what support that?
Yeah, you would see patterns in how people respond. So in the sort of methodology I would use, participant observation, ethnography, and so on, in interviewing, there's a concept of saturation. And that's a moment when you start to hear the same sorts of things or see the same sorts of things over and over again. I don't want to say it's not surprising because talking to humans is always surprising, but you're less and less surprised as time goes on. And
you hit saturation, and I was looking for the summary after that.
Yeah, exactly.
Very well. Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you everybody for the interesting discussion from the speaker.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Alessandra. Bye, everybody, and thank you for joining this meeting.
Survey